Hello, my name is Shannon McKenna Schmidt, and I'm the author of The First Lady of World War II. It's terrific to be with you today to talk about the extraordinary Eleanor Roosevelt, to share a lesser-known side of her as an adventurer and a traveler, and to highlight the part that she played during World War II. This story begins in August 1943, when the United States had been battling Japan for nearly 2 years. One night, a military transport plane traveling under the codename Flight 321 left San Francisco bound for the Pacific Theater. Inside the plane, it was bare bones, it was loud and rumbling, it was unpressurized, and it was freezing cold. On board, sharing space with supplies and sacks of mail, was First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. By the time Eleanor set out for the Pacific, she had been First Lady for a decade. She was famous for her travels, or infamous, depending on the perspective, and she constantly made headlines for them. When Eleanor entered the White House in 1933, the American public got a First Lady the likes of which they had never seen before. Traditionally, First Ladies stayed close to the White House, they primarily oversaw social functions, and they did not take an active part in public life. But at the time Eleanor became First Lady, she was already well established in her own right as an educator, a political advocate, a writer, a speaker, and a traveler. Eleanor was an early advocate of commercial air travel at a time when it was thought that only the most courageous and athletic people were fit to fly. And she was friends with Amelia Earhart and wanted to be a pilot herself. This was not a woman who was going to be grounded at the White House. Eleanor created for herself a unique role that combined her love of travel, her wanderlust, with her sense of social responsibility. She decided that she could best help her husband, the president, by being his eyes and ears, his listening post, and by keeping him in touch with public opinion, which she said is the moving force in a democracy. Eleanor ceaselessly crisscrossed the country, giving speeches, inspecting New Deal initiatives, seeing and meeting people, and gathering information. That information she used to exact change, either through her own means or by providing it to the president and his policy advisors. 1 year into his presidency, FDR asked Eleanor to go to Puerto Rico to investigate labor and living conditions, and the fact that she took a flight over water to get there cemented her reputation as fearless and unconventional. And around that time, she was featured on the cover of this general interest magazine and declared America's most traveled First Lady. As First Lady, Eleanor averaged an astounding 40,000 miles on the road each year. And yet, even for such an experienced traveler like Eleanor, the Pacific trip exceeded anything she had previously done, including a wartime trip to Great Britain the year before in 1942. This time, she would be on the road longer than ever before, traveling farther and at a faster pace, covering more ground, enduring more discomforts, and facing danger. Eleanor was heading into a theater of war unlike any other in history, one where fighting took place across great distances over water and on islands with harsh terrain. Life magazine used these aerial views of a globe to show its readers how the Pacific Ocean sprawls across nearly half the planet, transforming the area into what they described as the vastest single battlefield over which man has ever fought. Eleanor traveled for 5 weeks and covered 25,000 miles, a distance roughly equal to the Earth's circumference. She went to Hawaii, Australia, New Zealand, through the South Pacific, and, at her insistence, into territory that was still under enemy air attack. Eleanor predicted that the Pacific trip would cost her deeply, both physically and mentally, and in fact, this turned out to be true. Early on in the research process for the book, I came across something she wrote in an autobiography 6 years after the trip to the Pacific, and she said, "The Pacific trip left a mark from which I think I shall never be free." And I found this statement so powerful and haunting, and that she said it so many years later, and it really compelled me to uncover what she experienced during her time in the Pacific. So why did she do it? Why did she commit herself to such an arduous undertaking? Eleanor felt an enormous responsibility to contribute to the war effort, and she continually looked for ways to do that. To her frustration, some of the things that she wanted to do did not work out, and she was convinced that her association with the White House would prevent her from doing any real job in World War II. Then her journey to Great Britain proved differently. It was an important undertaking that was uniquely suited to her. She was world famous and well-renowned. She had the travel savvy, as well as the diplomatic skills, the people skills, the morale-building skills, and the reporting skills. The trip was a resounding success. Prime Minister Winston Churchill was impressed with the way that Eleanor charmed and bolstered the British people, telling her afterward, "You certainly have left golden footprints behind you." Eleanor's trip to the Pacific would draw on all those same skills, and it would require even more endurance and courage, which was exactly the kind of wartime task she wanted. Eleanor especially felt a sense of obligation toward the generation of young men being sent into battle. A primary reason for the trip was to thank U.S. troops herself and on behalf of the president and to build morale. And in all, she addressed more than 400,000 troops throughout her time in the Pacific. The trip was also an informal diplomatic mission to Allied nations Australia and New Zealand and to see the war work that women were doing in those countries. And Eleanor added even more onto her plate by going as a representative of the American Red Cross and inspecting the organization's facilities in the region. She packed no civilian clothing, and she wore only Red Cross uniforms during the trip, which pared down her clothing and helped her adhere to a strict luggage limit. Furthermore, the trip occurred at a crucial time in the war. By the summer of 1943, the tide was turning in the Allies' favor in Europe and the Pacific. Eleanor felt that people were overly optimistic about the war's outcome and that they were becoming dangerously complacent. There were strikes at war production factories across the country. People were complaining about food rationing and shortages. The trip would link the home front and the fighting front, reminding the nation that they could not give up on their duties until the war was won, and that any slackening in production risked the lives of the men on distant battlefields. For security reasons, the trip was kept secret for the first 10 days as Eleanor made her way from island to island through the South Pacific. Her first inspection stop was a U.S. Army outpost on Christmas Island, a speck of land so tiny she wondered why a large wave didn't come along and wash it away. Rumors were running rampant among the GIs on Christmas Island. They noticed that heightened security measures were being put in place, and they speculated that somebody important was coming to visit. They thought it might be a troop of chorus girls, or perhaps the politician Wendell Willkie, who had recently made an around-the-world tour and written a best-selling book about it. They were expecting a VIP, and yet they were astounded when Eleanor Roosevelt stepped off the plane. FDR specifically asked Eleanor to visit Christmas Island and other islands along the supply and communications route linking the United States with Australia. It was vital to keep the route open and protected, and yet the men on these islands felt marginalized and distant from the fighting, and as if they weren't making enough of a contribution to the war. And FDR wanted Eleanor to assure them that he knew the valuable job they were doing. On Christmas Island, Eleanor set the rigorous pace that she would keep throughout the trip. She went nonstop the entire 5 weeks, sleeping on army cots in rustic huts, traveling by jeep over rough terrain to reach isolated camps, and doing things like climbing a lookout tower on Christmas Island and getting an up-close look at a tank destroyer in Australia. She visited Red Cross clubs, she dined in mess halls, getting up at dawn to breakfast with servicemen, and she walked miles and miles of hospital wards. She inspected everything from laundry rooms to artillery headquarters to a dentist tent in the Australian outback, where a serviceman was having a tooth removed without making a sound. He said afterward, "It hurt like hell, but with Mrs. Roosevelt watching, I had to act tough." Eleanor took every opportunity to speak with servicemen, finding out what they wanted and what they needed immediately and after the war. Eleanor was an expert at fact-gathering. During her visit to Great Britain, an American reporter wrote in a London newspaper, "The best thing to do with Eleanor is to go through the necessary formalities and then just turn her loose. She can be depended upon to see everything there is to see and meet everyone worth meeting." In Bora Bora, instead of breakfasting as expected in the officers' mess, Eleanor surprised down the ranks by eating with the enlisted men, and she borrowed mess gear from an awestruck young serviceman. Not only is the First Lady in an active theater of war, she's reporting to the President and the home front while she's there. During her decade as First Lady, Eleanor had built up an extensive network of outlets that she used to communicate with the American public, holding her famous women-only press conferences, giving speeches across the country, making radio addresses, and writing a 6-day-a-week syndicated newspaper column called My Day. The strict luggage limit I mentioned earlier, part of the reason she pared down her wardrobe by wearing the uniforms was because she lugged a heavy manual typewriter with her to the Pacific so that she could keep writing My Day in real time, and copy was wired to her editor in New York. During World War II, Eleanor used these platforms to support the war effort and to help guide the nation, from urging women to seek employment in the defense industry to advocating for legislation to support veterans. She promoted the buying of war bonds and donating to the Red Cross Blood Bank, which was a new nationwide program at the time. The blood was turned into dried plasma and sent to the front lines, where it was kept in foxholes for use during battle. As Eleanor had been doing her entire time as First Lady, she used the knowledge she gleaned to advise on issues that otherwise might not have been known or fully understood. For example, she helped prepare the nation for the fact that men would be returning home with disabilities in greater numbers than ever before, and she did this by sharing the story of a soldier she met on Christmas Island whose leg was amputated after he was pinned beneath an overturned tank. Due to advances in medicine, like having blood plasma at the ready, if troops didn't die outright in battle, chances were they would live, albeit with physical disabilities. And Eleanor talked about this frequently and fervently, advising that these men be treated with helpfulness and understanding, not pity. And in fact, she told the home front that everyone had a responsibility to help returning fighters adjust to civilian life. Eleanor used her platforms to buoy home front morale and to admonish when necessary, such as chastising Americans for believing enemy propaganda and doing Hitler's work for him. Eleanor also used My Day to help maintain the secrecy of the Pacific trip. For the first 10 days of the trip, she had pre-written columns, and the byline listed her location as being at home in Hyde Park, New York. Eleanor continued to make her way through the South Pacific until she reached the island of New Caledonia, where she ran into a roadblock. That roadblock was Admiral William Halsey, commander of the South Pacific Forces and the man who would decide whether she was allowed to visit the island of Guadalcanal, her ultimate goal of the trip and which was still on the front lines. Admiral Halsey was not pleased to have Eleanor in the Pacific. He had nothing against her personally, he liked her, he admired her. What he didn't like were VIPs coming through his area and taking his focus away from the war, especially because he thought these visits were political gestures or superficial PR junkets. All very practical reasons that he objected, along with the fact that he would have to put on a tie. When Eleanor arrived at his headquarters, Admiral Halsey brusquely shut down the suggestion of her going to Guadalcanal, telling her, "Guadalcanal is no place for you, ma'am." He did make a slight concession, saying that he would wait to make a final decision until after she visited Australia and New Zealand and returned to New Caledonia, and he would see what the status was of current battle he was overseeing and whether he had any available fighter planes to escort her into Guadalcanal. Well, Eleanor was devastated at this immediate shutting down of her request, and she left for New Zealand in low spirits because she thought, given this initial reception, there was no way Admiral Halsey was going to agree to her going to Guadalcanal. After 10 days of secrecy, Eleanor landed in New Zealand and news broke about the trip. There wasn't so much surprise that she turned up on the other side of the world, but that it had been such a well-kept secret. There was a deluge of media coverage and, as with most of Eleanor's undertakings, controversy erupted. There was praise for what she was doing, and there was criticism. Newspaper editorials took sides, and people wrote letters to their local papers for and against Eleanor and the trip. The New York Herald Tribune ran side-by-side contrasting letters. One was from someone who lauded Eleanor, and the other was signed by disgusted citizen who demanded a congressional investigation into her activities. Among the detractors were the traditionalists still lamenting not having a more conventional first lady. Some of these people wrote directly to the president to gripe about Eleanor, like Mr. and Mrs. George Rogers of Atlanta, who sent this telegram asking FDR to confine Eleanor more to the White House. I figure FDR probably had a good laugh over that one. Eleanor's unconventionality is one of the things that the New Zealand and Australian newspapers celebrated. Eleanor was familiar to New Zealanders and Australians because of news coverage during her time as First Lady, and her reputation as an advocate for social justice preceded her. A New Zealand newspaper said at the time of her visit, "Mrs. Roosevelt is frequently described as the world's foremost female political force. She is the wife of a ruler, but her power comes from her influence not on him, but on public opinion. It is essentially a self-made influence. No other president's wife has exercised anything like the same power, either in her own land or in the world without." Another newspaper called Eleanor a great fighter in the cause of the world's freedom. They were particularly impressed that she was perhaps the only woman at whom Hitler screamed his denunciations. For years, Eleanor had been publicly speaking out against Hitler and Nazi aggression, and the Nazis noticed. A German newspaper threatened her by name, and Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, wrote in his diary, "Mrs. Roosevelt is shooting her mouth off around the country. If she were my wife, it would be a different story." Well, she wasn't his wife. She was FDR's wife, and he supported what she was doing. Eleanor was a presence on the global stage during World War II. She made 3 wartime trips overseas to Great Britain, the Pacific, and a year later to the Caribbean area. She was asked to make morale-raising radio addresses to women in Sweden, Brazil, France, and other countries. She was a voice to the Allied nations, so renowned and respected that she, and what she stood for, was a threat to the Axis. The media coverage during Eleanor's time in the Pacific was massive in part because her visit to New Zealand and Australia was a historic event. She was the first U.S. president's wife to visit, and that she traveled there during wartime made it even more impressive to them. Her visit generated a level of excitement that was on par with royalty, even blocking traffic in Sydney. This clipping is from a scrapbook sent to Eleanor by the New Zealand government commemorating the trip. Some old-timers in Australia's capital, Canberra, thought that Eleanor being there even eclipsed the excitement of a royal visit. With a notable difference, they loved her informality. The Australians in particular cheered whenever Eleanor broke with protocol. Like when she arrived at a government building and she broke away from the official party to walk across the grounds and speak with a group of women in uniform. They were part of the Women's Land Army, which was created during wartime to address labor shortages in the agricultural sector. Or the time Eleanor visited a cannery that prepared food for the troops, and she stood on a table in the dining hall to address the women who worked there. One of the most informal and delightful parties Eleanor attended was with U.S. Army and Navy nurses at a Red Cross club in Sydney. She shared in My Day that if she were young enough, she would like to have been a nurse in the Army or Navy because they most closely shared the men's experiences. Eleanor told My Day readers that every woman at home owed a debt of gratitude to the nurses in the Pacific. "They are not living very comfortably," she said. "They are seeing daily sights that must try their fortitude," and yet she never heard a single one complain. Eleanor was a little frustrated in Australia because she had an entourage of U.S. Army officers who insisted on following her around everywhere. Well, one day, at a hospital, she came to the bed of a young serviceman who handed her a long letter. She took out her glasses, she put them on, and she read the entire thing. She could see that this young man was distressed, and she asked everyone. In fact, she didn't even ask them. She ordered everyone, medical personnel, reporters, and high-ranking officers to go wait in the corridor while she spoke to this young man alone. And this is one instance out of many that illustrates Eleanor's caring about the servicemen on an individual level. After leaving Australia, Eleanor went off the grid again for security reasons. She returned to Admiral Halsey's headquarters on New Caledonia, where she received some great news. She was going to Guadalcanal. Why the change of heart on Admiral Halsey's part? Eleanor won his support not by making arguments, but by the power of her example. Through his own observations, along with reports from other military personnel throughout the region and a tremendous amount of press coverage, he saw that her motivation was genuine and that this trip was no superficial PR junket. Eleanor Roosevelt was the real deal. Admiral Halsey later admitted to being sorry for his original surliness, and allowing her to go to Guadalcanal was a sign of respect for her. Also, Admiral Halsey was shrewd. If all went well while Eleanor was on Guadalcanal, it would generate good publicity, and you need good publicity to keep public approval high for the war and to keep funding flowing. But ultimately, what it came down to, and why I think he allowed her to go to Guadalcanal, was that morale wins wars, and he could see the uplifting effect that her presence had on the troops. Here is this gruff, tough admiral, and he said what he marveled at most were the expressions on the men's faces as Eleanor leaned over them in their hospital beds. He said most people came through his area, glanced into a sun parlor at a hospital, and left. Eleanor, meanwhile, went bed to bed, comforting the wounded. Admiral Halsey knew the importance of that. When he took over command of Guadalcanal, he visited the front lines as soon as he could. And on his way back to his headquarters, he stopped on another island to visit a naval hospital where he went bed to bed speaking with injured servicemen. It not only buoyed their morale, it buoyed the morale of the men on Guadalcanal when they heard about it. Eleanor even went a step further. A practice she began in Great Britain was to keep logbooks of the wounded servicemen she met. And in these logbooks, she recorded each person's name, his injuries, and where and how he received them, such as Second Lieutenant Leroy Mitchell, a bombardier in a B-17 who had a ruptured eye from being shot in the face during an attack by Japanese fighter planes in the skies over Papua New Guinea. Also recorded in the logbooks was the name and address of a family member for Eleanor to contact after her return, and she did contact the families. Letters took weeks to get to the Pacific and back, and to have recent first-hand news of your loved one from the First Lady of the United States was pretty extraordinary. Although Eleanor called one serviceman's girlfriend and she hung up on her because she didn't believe it was the First Lady calling and she thought she was being pranked. So now, Admiral Halsey is fully on board with Eleanor's visit to Guadalcanal, and any misgivings he still had about her going were solely out of concern for her safety. Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands was the site of the first major Allied offensive in the Pacific War. Visiting there was a tribute Eleanor felt she owed to the men in uniform, to see where so many had lost their lives or received their injuries. She had already met a lot of these men who had been wounded on Guadalcanal while visiting hospitals in the United States and in the Pacific. Eleanor's respect for the troops' sacrifices was deeply personal. All 4 of her sons were serving in various branches of the military on active duty, including her son James, a Marine who fought in the Solomon Islands campaign. In the early morning hours, under cover of darkness, Eleanor left for Guadalcanal in a heavily gunned U.S. Navy bomber, which flew with lights out to evade detection. She sat on a makeshift seat over the bomb bay, ears ringing and shivering in the dark. Despite the difficulties of the 3-hour ride, Eleanor was elated at achieving her goal. As the bomber closed in on Guadalcanal, 6 fighter planes appeared to escort it the rest of the way. As it turns out, Admiral Halsey's concerns about Eleanor's safety were warranted. Guadalcanal was bombed several nights before and after her visit, leading him to speculate whether the Japanese also had code breakers. With the manual typewriter Eleanor hauled around the Pacific, she kept a diary that was shared in installments with the president. In one entry, she described an air raid alert that sounded while she was on Guadalcanal. Along with the hospital staff and the ambulatory patients, she was taken to an underground shelter to wait for the all clear. After the all clear sounded, she didn't miss a beat, and she got right back to business going through the hospital wards. The danger associated with the trip didn't faze Eleanor. Even traveling in a military transport plane for 5 weeks was risky, as they weren't the most reliable aircraft. To save time, rather than design transport planes from scratch, the military modified heavy bombers. One pilot bluntly described a converted bomber to transport plane as an evil bastard contraption. On Eleanor's return home, the planned route was changed at the last minute because of reports of Japanese aircraft in the area for retaliatory raids. Eleanor had courage in spades, and as I said, the danger didn't concern her. What greatly impacted her was the massive scale of suffering she witnessed. She said that one sees the results of the war in the hospitals. Eleanor was a class act when she was going through the hospital wards, bed to bed, offering words of comfort or a joke. But she said that inside she was burning with resentment at what was being done to these young men. Eleanor was extremely forthright when reporting back to the American public and making them understand the human cost of the war. In a radio address after her return from the Pacific, she told of a young man she met in a first-line hospital, so recently injured that he was still in the set of bandages from when he fell in battle. All he had to his name was a Red Cross comfort kit. He was in pain, and yet he still managed to smile and thank the people who were helping him. In that same address, she told people to stop complaining about food rationing and shortages because it was nothing compared to lying on your back in a jungle swamp while an enemy camouflaged in the trees took shots at you. In another speech, she recalled the shadowed eyes of the men who had endured the savagery of jungle warfare. Eleanor went to great lengths to understand jungle warfare, which was a new type of fighting for American servicemen. She had a reputation for wanting to see things for herself, and that's exactly what she did, even trekking through the jungle on a training exercise. She wished she had seen the training before answering a letter she received from a serviceman's mother. The woman was outraged that her son was being trained in the Louisiana swamps, which she thought was cruel and unnecessary. Eleanor said, "I might have been able to explain to her that it was for her son's own safety in the future." Eleanor's final stop in the Pacific was Honolulu. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, she was the first public figure to address the nation. She was scheduled to broadcast her weekly radio show that same evening, and she went on the air as planned, offering an encouraging message to the American people. Here is Eleanor on the USS Oklahoma, a battleship that was torpedoed and sank at Pearl Harbor, taking 429 sailors down with her. At the time of Eleanor's visit, the Oklahoma had been raised from the harbor floor and was being held upright with cables, but it was not yet afloat. As Eleanor predicted, the trip took a huge physical and emotional toll on her. She lost 30 pounds while she was overseas, and after she returned home, she fell into a deep depression. A close friend of hers explained it by saying, as long as she had to keep going, her iron will carried her through, in spite of her deep horror at what she saw and the great sadness at the continued bloodshed and dying. As Time magazine pointed out, no other U.S. mother had seen so much of the panorama of the war, had been closer to the sweat and boredom, the suffering. And yet the Pacific trip made Eleanor determined to work even harder, to see the war through and to strive for peace so that this carnage never happened again. A near-term goal was to see a support program established for returning servicemen. During all of the conversations that Eleanor had with servicemen in mess halls and Red Cross clubs throughout the Pacific, the things she heard most were that they needed supplies to win the war and that they wanted opportunities for jobs and education when they returned home. Eleanor used the power of her public platform to help ensure that this was done, bringing pressure to bear on Congress. Legislation needed to be passed immediately and not after the war ended, both to assist the great number of men already returning and to boost the morale of those still on the fighting front. As a soldier explained to Eleanor, and she shared this in my day, they weren't afraid of being killed or maimed. What they were afraid of is that when they finally returned home and began piecing their lives back together, that they would be made to feel like suckers for the sacrifices they had made. The GI Bill of Rights was signed into law the next year. One of the most telling instances about the validity of Eleanor's trip to the Pacific was Admiral Halsey completely changing his mind about her being there, and he was not inclined to change his mind easily. He said, "She alone accomplished more good than any other person or any group of civilians who passed through my area." Due to the concern about the retaliatory raids on Eleanor's way home, the transport plane was detoured to Christmas Island, where she had begun the trip weeks earlier. When the inevitable controversy erupted over the trip, the soldiers on Christmas Island had Eleanor's back, and they took on her detractors in their troop publication. A GI journalist reported, "Her kindness and consideration brought this island of forgotten men very much back to life." Another said, "It takes great courage to do what Mrs. Roosevelt is now doing, and you have to hand it to her. She has what it takes." During the dozen years Eleanor spent as First Lady, upending tradition and breaking new ground, her journey to the front lines powerfully illustrates how dramatically she transformed the role. The Pacific trip exemplifies so much of what is admired about Eleanor: her courage, her compassion, her connections with people, her crusading for a better world. And it shows how important her leadership was during World War II. A reporter at the time described Eleanor's trip to the Pacific, and I believe this still stands, as the most remarkable journey any president's wife has ever made. Thank you all so much for listening, and now I look forward to Q&A.
How are you this morning?
I'm doing very well, thank you. How are you?
That was an amazing presentation. Thanks for joining us. That was
Oh, thank
awesome.
you. It's absolutely my pleasure to be here.
Where are you right now?
I am in Hoboken, New Jersey.
Oh, okay. Not that far away from DC. So we have one comment. I've asked everybody to pepper you with questions because it's such a really great opportunity to learn more about a wonderful, wonderful woman. I have one question, or rather statement, and given that it's Women's History Month, would you agree that behind every great man is an even greater woman?
Why, yes, I would absolutely agree with that.
That's a. I'm obviously going to get that answer, but anyway, what was it about her story that really appealed to you? Why did you decide to spend a couple of years of your life at least, right,
Yeah.
devoted to this?
Yeah. So, and from coming up with the initial idea to turning in my final manuscript was 4 years.
Wow.
And it was a really wonderful journey working on the book. I first came across the idea reading a collection of Eleanor's column, My Day. I talked a lot in the presentation about My Day and how what a critical resource that was for her to communicate with the American public. And I was reading a collection of the columns, and there was just the briefest of mentions that she visited Australia during the Pacific, visiting the Pacific Theater. But it caught my interest right away because I had recently been to Australia and New Zealand, and I really connected with Eleanor Roosevelt, the traveler. Travel's been a huge part of my life. And so from there, it really spun out. And very early on, the quote that I referenced, "The Pacific trip left a mark from which I think I shall never be free." I came across that pretty early on, and that really did um, compel me to follow every thread of this story that I could.
What is your own background? Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Yes, so I spent the first 10 years of my working life working in the book publishing industry. I then decided to become a freelance writer. And in 2010, my husband and I said, we'd been planning for a while to travel full time. And so in 2010, we set out in an RV with our cat, and we traveled the US for 4 years in an RV. Then we downsized. Our cat had left us of natural causes. And we backpacked around the globe for 3 years after that. So we spent 7 years traveling full time. And I did my freelance writing the entire time that I was on the road.
Do you not feel like do you not have withdrawal symptoms from that right now? Where are you? Are you there for a while, or are you about to take off again?
Yeah, well, so we have a home base now in Hoboken, New Jersey, which is where we lived before. But yes, I'll tell you this, we're having some really nice spring-like weather, and there's something about the spring that always makes me feel very restless and like I need to go back on the road.
I'm very, very jealous. A question from Pat here. She says, terrific book. Eleanor was well known before this for her travels. Was there something that surprised you as you did your research?
Yeah, I was surprised that Eleanor wanted to be a pilot herself. And she took the necessary physical exam to get your student pilot's license. And Amelia Earhart was actually going to be her instructor. But FDR really did not ask Eleanor to scale back much of anything, but he said, "Hey, I'm about to be president. Could you please not add to my worries by, I gotta worry about you up there in an airplane." So he did not ask her to pull back on much, but she did honor that request of his. So she never did officially become a pilot. But there is one anecdote about how she took the controls of a friend's plane flying from through the Hudson Valley to New York City. So she still got those adventure moments. And in the bomber that left Guadalcanal and flew back to another island, she did sit in the co-pilot seat on part of that ride back and was there when they landed.
Can you just briefly list the ways in which she was a pioneer as a first lady?
Yeah, so many ways. Certainly the causes that she's out there advocating for: women's rights, civil rights. Gosh, even just advocating for basic human decency at the time was unconventional for a first lady to have this public life. And another thing that surprised me was how controversial it was that she traveled. In the magazine cover that I showed, in that accompanying article, the reporter says something like that the nation, unused to first ladies darting about, watched her with mingled admiration and alarm. So this was very, very unconventional at the time. And certainly think about a woman traveling in the 30s and 40s by herself, without her husband or a man escorting her. And that really was one of the reasons, and a main reason, that she was considered an unconventional first lady.
What did you learn about her husband during your research? Was there something that you really began to appreciate that you hadn't realized before?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that FDR should be given his due. Certainly, he supported Eleanor being a traveler. He did benefit from it politically with the information that she gathered. But I think that he also knew that she needed this personally. And to her, she always traveled to see and meet people, to gather information, but it also embodied freedom for Eleanor, this ability to travel. And FDR 100% supported that. And in fact, Eleanor won a showdown with the Secret Service because they didn't want her to go about unprotected. And she's like, "No way are you guys following me around everywhere." So they did ask that she keep a gun in the glove box of her car, which she did, and she learned how to use it. So, I think that the story of Eleanor and her travels certainly includes FDR.
We have a comment from Robert, and he says a lot of the pushback against Eleanor was the old right versus left, which is alive and well today. That's an interesting comment, but surely it just came down to good old-fashioned sexism, which is still rampant today.
Yes, unfortunately, that is rampant today. A lot of what she did, she got criticism from Republicans, from
Sure.
the other political side. And even the Pacific trip got everybody. They came at her for that. There was a lot of misinformation about the trip. Her critics in the press and in Congress um, like to accuse her of using fuel, when in fact she flew on a regular flight of the Air Transport Command that would have been going anyway. The racists in the United States got riled up because when she was in Rotorua, New Zealand, the home of the Maori, the indigenous people of New Zealand, she received a traditional Maori greeting, which was a pressing of noses. And this just created a huge controversy. There was a congressman from Michigan who ranted about that on the House floor. The governor of, I think it was Alabama, Chauncey Sparks, while Eleanor was in the Pacific, he announced to the press that he was going to denounce her at the forthcoming Democratic National Convention while pushing a platform of white supremacy. So yeah, I mean, a lot of it was along political lines, even in response to this trip. And, but Eleanor, she just did her thing. She wrote an article titled How to Take Criticism, and she addressed the issue. She said, you're damned if you do and damned if you don't. So you may as well do what you think is right and what you believe in.
So Gwen, the wonderful author that preceded you, she has a comment. There is so much about her that is groundbreaking. Was it hard to choose the focus of the Pacific trip?
The Pacific trip actually ended up being a very good lens through which to see her, Eleanor, as a person and a lot of the things that she stood for. When I first started, because she did take three wartime trips, Great Britain, the Pacific, and the Caribbean area, I at first thought, oh, well, maybe I would encompass all three. And then I thought, well, maybe I'll do Great Britain and the Pacific. But it became apparent that there really was just so much material, and that the Pacific trip did lend itself to seeing her in this way. And also, I tried to make the reader understand what was happening in the Pacific theater and what it was like for our servicemen over there at the time, because the European theater was much more immediate to Americans. This Pacific theater is way off. It's on the other side of the world. And Eleanor really tried to bring some of that immediacy home to the American people through her writings and speeches.
How was she changed by World War II?
She was she was devastated about the war. I mentioned that she lost 30 pounds just while she was overseas in the Pacific. She fell into a huge depression. She was very personally and emotionally wrecked by what was happening to this generation of young men. And it really did make her determined to work even harder for peace. And I think that the seeds of her later work with the United Nations can be seen in this trip to the Pacific Theater. And in fact, while she was in Rockhampton, Australia, the mayor there gave a speech, and he said that he would like to see Eleanor at the peace table, and that he felt that he probably wasn't alone in wanting that. And because of circumstances, FDR's unexpected death, she, in fact, and without that happening, I don't know that she would have gone to the United Nations as a delegate. And so instead, she goes to the United Nations. She was in the first contingent of delegates. She was the only woman. And so she does get to take her advocacy and her desire for peace and go work for that on the world stage.
We have a comment from Janet, and she says, very informative, great presentation, thank you. Was there any chance that she would have toured the European theatre? And then she adds, my dad fought over there. He served under Patton. Do you think she would have gotten along with General Patton?
I think
She
Eleanor had
cursed
this
a lot.
extraordinary,
Did she curse? I mean, was she?
you know, the damn. When I said she actually wrote in that How to Take Criticism article, you're damned if you do and damned if you don't. So she did say damn. I know that much at least. So when war in Europe broke out in 1939, what Eleanor most wanted to do was go abroad and work with the Red Cross, aiding people displaced by the turmoil. But because Hitler's forces were advancing so swiftly, there was concern she could be taken captive, and the State Department denied her request. So I think that no, she probably would not, based on that at least, have gone to the European theater. Great Britain was deemed safe enough for her to be there, although that was dangerous too. And they were still being bombed by Nazis. And in fact, Canterbury, England, was bombed a few hours after she was there. But yeah, I think, to answer that question, in my opinion, I don't think that she would have been allowed to go to the European theater.
Uh, Given that she was First Lady for so long, do you think she's the most impactful by far of all First Ladies in US history?
I may be biased, but I most definitely think so. Because she was the longest serving first lady, a dozen years,
Yeah.
and no others have done it for that long. And also, I think that Eleanor Eleanor wasn't afraid to break with the tradition of what was expected of a first lady. And that was pretty extraordinary, even doing that. And also the other thing that she did was she went about unaccompanied all around the United States. She was going and seeking out people in their communities. And think about a first lady today. I don't think they're going to be like, well, I don't want Secret Service protection. And she was flying commercial. In fact, she flew on a commercial flight from New York to San Francisco when she set out for the Pacific Theater. And she liked that. She liked the camaraderie with the public. So I think for those reasons alone, that she was very, I think, the most impactful first lady.
So we have another question here from David Trail in Florida, and he says, your presentation shows a lot of preparation and knowledge. Great job. And I will echo that. How difficult was it for the Secret Service agents traveling with her?
Well, she refused their protection most of the time. If security was provided in a location where she went on the other end, say she was doing a speech in, I don't know, Chicago, it was up to the people on the end what kind of security that they provided. But here's just a little example of what the Secret Service would encounter with Eleanor. So she went to visit the Tuskegee Airmen in, I think that's Alabama. And she wanted to take a flight with one of them. And we're talking like a little, like tiny plane. I don't know if it was a two-seater, but it wasn't much bigger than that, open on the top. And the Secret Service was there. And I don't know how much of this is just anecdotal, but legend has it that they rang up the White House and wanted to talk to FDR because they were trying to dissuade Eleanor from doing this. And he's like, well, what am I going to do about it? I can't stop her. So that is an anecdote that I love about Eleanor. And it's true. Nothing was going to stop her that day from getting into the skies with this Tuskegee Airmen.
Then we have another comment here. As a strong advocate of peace and of human stroke civil rights, she did advocate for FDR's war policies and did she advocate for FDR's war policies and did America's hesitation to deal with the Holocaust cause her personal anguish? That's not my comment. That's from someone listening. We come to this very thorny issue about FDR and the Holocaust. So I don't want to throw you into hot water there, but you must have come across this before. Did he do enough? Didn't he do enough? What did he know? What didn't he know?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I can't really answer that, or don't feel like I have the authority to answer that. But one of the things that I found really interesting is that Eleanor and FDR, even when it came to politics, had this symbiotic relationship. He would often ask her to, say, float an idea in my day and see how it went over. But she did have this sense of what she would say in public versus what she was saying behind the scenes to FDR. For example, the internment of Japanese Americans, she was against. Didn't speak out publicly about it, but behind the scenes working for that. So I'm sorry. I wish that I could answer that more about the Holocaust, but my research just took me in a different direction.
In what other ways did she influence FDR during World War II? I mean, you mentioned the Japanese American internment. Were there other specific examples of where he actually listened to her and did something?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest things was the legislation for servicemen, and Eleanor was advocating for that from the start of the war. And but other people wanted to wait on that. And she was very instrumental in that, bringing public pressure to bear. And she was very pleased because right before she left for the Pacific, FDR did address it in one of his radio addresses. And Eleanor encouraged people in my day to go talk to their local congressional representatives and express what they and their servicemen wanted to see. So I do think that that was one area where she was influential because I can't overstate the importance and the impact of these platforms that she had to communicate with the American public.
How did American women view Eleanor Roosevelt? Was she an inspirational figure to Rosie the Riveter?
I think that Eleanor sharply divided public opinion. I think that there were a lot of people, women included, who embraced her, admired her, and then of course there were detractors. Um, so yeah, so that went both ways. The year before she went to the Pacific, it was after she went to Great Britain, there was a Gallup poll, and it said that probably more than any other woman in American history that she sharply divided public opinion.
Until we have Hillary Clinton, but another. Sorry, we won't go there. Um, can you tell us what you're going to do next? What are you fascinated by right now?
I would like to perhaps write about some of Eleanor's other travels, because she really did kick her travels into high gear after she left the White House. She went around the world a couple of times, so I'm going to look into exploring some of her other trips. And frankly, I just want to spend more time with Eleanor Roosevelt.
Some might say that it was a shame that FDR didn't spend a lot more time with Eleanor Roosevelt during World War II anyway.
Well, I actually one of the things that also about her travels is that it was a touchstone for them to stay connected because after Eleanor went on a trip, they would meet one on one and discuss it, and they did that after the Pacific. And so I found that really neat that it was a way for them to stay in touch, and particularly as the war took more and more of his time, for them to have even a couple of hours alone to discuss the Pacific trip would have been pretty huge. And in fact, when Eleanor came back from England, she was gone for a month, and FDR was like, "Can you send her back?" And when the plane flew in over Washington, D.C., she could see this hoopla on the tarmac with the Secret Service and FDR, and she knew that he had taken time out of his busy schedule to come meet her. So I like that her travels were a way that they stayed connected.
Um, do you speak to young audiences of women? Have you spoken to high school classes, etc.?
I have not about this topic, no.
Do you think that she would be a very inspirational or powerful role model for young American women today?
I think that she absolutely would. And it's funny, we were talking about the poll before about how she sharply divided public opinion when this poll was taken in 1942, because she regularly is very high up in polls today about most admired women and most admired first ladies.
One last question from me before I thank you profusely. When are we going to have somebody who isn't an old white guy in the White House?
You know, I really would like to know the same thing. And Eleanor there were people who floated the idea and asked for her to run as VP after FDR passed away. But Eleanor decided that she didn't want to hold any public office, that she thought that she could do more good working at the United Nations and as a private citizen.
Well, I just want to say thank you on behalf of Friends for a really superb, slick, professional, inspiring presentation. It was really nice of you to give us your time and your energy and passion. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I had a wonderful time. I loved the questions. So thank you for having me.